Every town has a piece of land nobody wants. The kind of place people warn newcomers about. The kind neighbors point to and shake their heads at when they drive past. In a quiet farming community in the American Midwest, that place had a name whispered more often than it was spoken aloud. Locals called it cursed. Real estate agents refused to even list it. The county assessor had stopped bothering to update its value years earlier because nobody believed it would ever sell again. But on a cold morning in the fall, a man named Walter Hendricks parked his truck at the edge of that ruined property, stepped out into the mud, and did something nobody in that town expected him to do. He bought it, and he paid for every acre in cash. Walter wasn't a wealthy man. He was a husband, a father of 3, and a man who had spent the last decade working paycheck to paycheck just to keep his family afloat. The money he used to buy that land was every dollar he and his wife had saved over 18 years of marriage. It was supposed to be for his children's future, for college, for emergencies, for the kind of stability his own parents never had. Instead, he handed it all over for a piece of ground that 2 families before him had already lost everything trying to farm. His wife didn't speak to him for 3 days after the papers were signed. She wasn't angry. She was afraid. Word spread through town before the ink had even dried. At the diner on Main Street, men who had never once set foot on that land suddenly had strong opinions about it. They laughed. They said Walter had lost his mind, that he'd thrown away nearly 2 decades of savings on dirt that had already swallowed 2 families whole. His own brother-in-law told him to his face that he was making the biggest mistake of his life, and that he'd be selling the equipment for scrap within a year. Walter said nothing back. He simply nodded, paid for his coffee, and drove home to a wife who was terrified and children who didn't yet understand why their father looked so calm in the middle of what felt, to everyone else, like a slow-motion disaster. Now, picture that same stretch of land today, where there was once collapsed fencing, dry wells, and soil so depleted that nothing would grow in it. There now stands a full operation with modern equipment, dozens of employees, and a business that supplies products to customers across 3 states. The man they mocked at that diner, the man his own family begged to walk away, is now worth an estimated $47 million. The same neighbors who once told him he was throwing his life away now drive past that property every single morning on their way to work, watching trucks roll in and out of a business bigger than anything their small town had ever produced before. But the story of how Walter Hendricks got from that cold morning in the mud to where he stands today is not the simple, straight-line success story you might expect. There were nights he sat alone in that broken-down barn and seriously considered walking away from everything he'd built. There was a point where the bank called in a loan he couldn't pay, and he had less than a week to find an answer. There was a decision made almost by accident, born out of desperation rather than genius, that ended up changing the entire course of his life and the lives of everyone in that town. None of it happened the way anyone, including Walter himself, thought it would. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a man who faced public ridicule from his own neighbors ended up rewriting his family's entire future, we have to go back to the very beginning. Back to the day he first stood on that land, looked out at what everyone else saw as a wasteland, and made a decision that would either destroy him or define him for the rest of his life. But before any of what came next could happen, he first had to sign the papers that everyone in town, including the people closest to him, begged him not to sign. To understand what really happened on that land, you have to understand the people involved. There was Walter Hendricks, a man raised on stories of hard work paying off, who had spent almost his entire adult life waiting for a chance to prove that mindset right. There was his wife, Diane, who had trusted him with every major decision they'd made together for 18 years, but who now found herself questioning whether that trust had finally run out. There was Frank, Walter's brother-in-law, a man respected in town for his own successful business, who saw Walter's purchase not as bold but as reckless, and who made sure everyone within earshot knew exactly how he felt about it. And then there was the land itself, over 200 acres that had already bankrupted 2 previous owners, land the bank itself had hesitated to even finance. That hesitation is where the real story quietly begins. When Walter first walked into the bank to request a loan for equipment and repairs, the loan officer looked at the property records and nearly refused him outright. 2 foreclosures in 9 years on the same piece of ground was not something any bank wanted attached to a new borrower. Walter was approved, but only after agreeing to terms most people in his position would have considered nearly impossible to meet. He didn't tell Diane how close he'd come to being turned away completely. He didn't tell her that the branch manager had personally warned him he was making a mistake. He simply came home that evening and told her everything was handled. So here is what we know for certain. A man with no farming background and no financial safety net bought land that had already ruined 2 families before him. He paid in cash, wiping out nearly 2 decades of savings in a single afternoon. His own family, the people who knew him best, believed he had made an irreversible error. And yet, years later, that same man stands at the head of a business worth tens of millions of dollars. Somewhere between that first cold morning in the mud and where he stands today, something happened that nobody, not Diane, not Frank, not even Walter himself, could have fully prepared for. What was it that Walter saw in that land that 2 previous owners, an entire town, and even his own family completely missed? Why was he so certain when every person around him was so certain of the opposite? And what happened in those first difficult years that came close enough to breaking him that he seriously considered walking away from everything he'd risked? To answer those questions, we have to go back further than the day he signed the papers. We have to go back to the life Walter Hendricks lived before that land ever entered the picture, because nothing about what came next makes sense without understanding where he started. Walter Hendricks grew up in a small house on the edge of a working-class neighborhood, the son of a machinist who spent 32 years at the same factory without ever missing a shift. His father believed there were only 2 kinds of people in the world, those who worked and those who made excuses, and he raised Walter to never be the second kind. Money was always tight growing up. Walter remembers his mother stretching a single grocery bill across 2 weeks and never once complaining about it in front of him. What he took from those years wasn't resentment, but a quiet belief that hard work, applied consistently enough and long enough, eventually paid off. It was a belief he carried into every job he ever held, and one that would be tested more severely than he could have imagined once he stood on that ruined piece of land decades later. In his mid-20s, Walter had a chance to invest in a small hardware business with a childhood friend who had inherited a modest storefront from his own father. It required nearly all the savings Walter had at the time, and everyone around him, including his own father, told him it was too risky for a man with no real capital behind him. Walter walked away from that opportunity, and the business went on to become one of the most successful hardware chains in the region over the following 15 years. He never spoke about it often, but those closest to him knew that missed opportunity sat with him for years afterward, a quiet reminder of a moment he chose safety over conviction, and one he privately promised himself he would not repeat if a similar chance ever came again. He met Diane at 28, working the front counter of an auto parts store where he'd taken a job after leaving factory work behind. She was finishing a nursing certification at the time, paying her own way through school while working nights, and Walter has said more than once that her discipline was the first thing he noticed about her. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony neither family could afford to make bigger, and within the first decade of their marriage they had 3 children. Diane's nursing income and Walter's steady but modest wages were enough to get by, but never enough to feel secure. They lived carefully, saved what they could, and told themselves that eventually, with enough patience, things would loosen up. For 18 years, that patience held. By the time Walter turned 44, he and Diane had managed to save just under $200,000, money they had built one paycheck at a time with almost no financial help from anyone. It sat in a savings account earning almost nothing, untouched except in true emergencies, earmarked in both their minds for their children's education and for the kind of stability neither of them had grown up with. Diane checked that balance every few months the way some people check a scoreboard, a quiet measure of how far they'd come from where they started. Neither of them ever imagined that money would one day be spent in a single afternoon on 200 acres of land that the rest of the town considered worthless. The land itself had a long and difficult history before Walter ever laid eyes on it. It had originally belonged to a farming family for 3 generations, until poor yields and mounting debt forced a foreclosure in the mid-90s. A second family bought it a few years later at a reduced price, convinced they could succeed where the first family had failed, only to lose it themselves within a decade. By the time Walter first drove past the property, the land had sat mostly untouched for years, fences collapsed in sections, the old farmhouse stripped of anything valuable by scavengers, and weeds standing taller than a grown man in places where crops once grew. Locals had stopped seeing it as farmland at all. To them, it was simply the place nothing could survive. Walter first noticed the land almost by accident, driving a longer route home from a job site to avoid construction on the main road. He has said the first time he saw it, something about the way the light hit the far end of the property, near a slow-moving creek that cut along the eastern edge, made him slow the truck down without fully understanding why. He didn't stop that day. He didn't tell Diane about it that night either. But over the following weeks, he found himself taking that same longer route home more often than the construction actually required. Each time studying the property a little longer, each time noticing some new detail the town's dismissive reputation of the land had never accounted for. It took nearly 2 months before Walter mentioned the property to anyone. When he finally brought it up to Diane, he framed it carefully, almost casually, as nothing more than an interesting piece of land he'd noticed on his drive home. Diane didn't think much of it at the time. She has said since that she assumed it was simply Walter thinking out loud, the way he sometimes did about ideas that never went anywhere. What she didn't know yet was that Walter had already driven out to walk the property alone twice, had already spoken briefly with the county assessor's office about its history, and had already begun quietly running numbers in his head that he had no intention of sharing with her until he was certain of what he wanted to do. By the time Walter finally told Diane he wanted to buy the land, he had already made up his mind. What followed was not a conversation, but closer to a negotiation, one that stretched over several tense nights at their kitchen table after the children had gone to sleep. Diane raised every objection a reasonable person would raise. The land's history, their savings, the fact that Walter had no background in agriculture beyond a childhood spent occasionally helping an uncle bale hay. Walter had no clean answers for most of her objections. What he had instead was a conviction he couldn't fully explain, a certainty that the land held something the previous 2 owners had missed entirely, something he intended to find no matter what it cost him. What Walter could not have known, sitting at that kitchen table trying to convince his wife of something he barely understood himself, was just how close that conviction would come to costing him everything he loved. The land would test him in ways far beyond money. It would strain his marriage, damage his standing with his own family, and bring him within days of losing it all before it ever gave anything back. But on the morning he finally drove to the bank to arrange the loan that would let him make an offer, none of that had happened yet. All he knew was that he had made his decision, and that in a matter of weeks, the whole town would know it too. The morning Walter signed the papers, the loan officer at the bank slid the documents across the desk without much ceremony, the way a man does when he has already said everything he intends to say about a decision he considers a mistake. Walter read every page carefully before signing, not because he doubted his choice, but because he understood exactly how much was riding on it. $200,000, nearly every cent he and Diane had built over 18 years, was about to be exchanged for 200 acres that had already ruined 2 families before him. When he finally set the pen down, the loan officer shook his hand and told him, without much warmth, that he hoped Walter knew what he was doing. Walter simply nodded. He drove straight from the bank to the property, parked at the edge of it, and stood there alone for nearly an hour before telling another living soul. Word moved through town faster than Walter expected. By the following afternoon, the men at the diner on Main Street already knew the full purchase price, though nobody could quite explain how. Frank heard about it secondhand, from a customer at his own business, before Walter ever had the chance to tell him directly. When Frank finally called that evening, his voice carried none of the usual warmth between them. He asked Walter flatly whether he understood that 2 other men, both smarter with money than Walter had ever claimed to be, had already lost everything trying to make that same land work. Walter didn't argue. He simply told Frank he had made his decision and that he intended to see it through, a response Frank later admitted made him more concerned, not less. At the diner, the conversation about Walter's purchase became something close to entertainment. Men who had never once driven past the property debated the details of the sale as if they had personally inspected the soil. Someone joked that Walter had finally found a way to make his savings disappear faster than losing it at a casino. Another said he'd give it 18 months before the bank took the land back a third time. Diane heard versions of these conversations secondhand from neighbors who meant well but couldn't resist repeating what they'd heard. She stopped mentioning the purchase to anyone outside the family entirely, partly out of loyalty to Walter, and partly because she wasn't yet convinced herself that he hadn't made a terrible mistake. Despite everything being said about him, Walter began working the land within days of closing on the sale. He spent his weekends clearing collapsed fencing by hand, hauling out decades of debris left behind by scavengers, and walking the full perimeter of the property again and again, studying the soil, the slope of the fields, and the slow-moving creek that cut along the eastern edge. It was during one of these early walks, weeks before he had any real plan for the land, that Walter first noticed something the previous two owners apparently never had. Even in a stretch of unusually dry weather that summer, when neighboring creeks and ponds across the county had visibly shrunk, the creek on his property ran exactly as full as it always had. He mentioned the observation to almost no one at the time, filing it away the way a person files away a strange detail they don't yet understand the importance of. His focus, for those first several months, remained on more immediate problems. The old irrigation system on the property was beyond repair. The soil in the western fields tested poorly for the kind of row crops the previous owners had attempted. Equipment he purchased secondhand to save money broke down within weeks, costing him repair bills he hadn't budgeted for. Every dollar he spent came directly out of savings that were never meant to stretch this far, and by the end of that first year, the number in the account Diane used to check like a scoreboard had fallen further than either of them wanted to say out loud. Diane's fear during that first year was never really about the land itself. It was about watching her husband, a man she had always known as careful and deliberate, make one large financial decision after another based on instincts he couldn't fully explain to her. She asked him more than once what his actual plan was, and more than once, Walter admitted he didn't have one beyond a conviction that something on that land was worth the risk. It was not the answer she wanted, and there were nights that first winter when she lay awake calculating how much longer their remaining savings could realistically last, doing math that grew more uncomfortable with each passing month. Neither of them yet understood that the hardest part of Walter's decision was still ahead of them. By the start of the second year, the reality of what Walter had taken on had fully settled in. The remaining savings were nearly gone, spent on equipment repairs, fencing materials, seed for crops that yielded far less than he'd hoped, and a property tax bill that arrived larger than either he or Diane had anticipated. Walter had taken on part-time work repairing farm equipment for neighbors, just to keep enough cash flowing to cover basic expenses, work that left him little time or energy for the land itself. Diane picked up additional nursing shifts, quietly, without making it a point of conversation between them, because both of them understood without saying it aloud that they were now surviving month to month on a decision the entire town still considered reckless. Frank's visits during this period grew less frequent, and when he did stop by, the conversation between the two men carried a tension neither of them had experienced before in their relationship. Frank had built his own business carefully over the years, avoiding unnecessary risk at every turn, and watching Walter struggle only confirmed what he had believed from the beginning. During one visit, standing near the collapsed remains of the old farmhouse, Frank told Walter plainly that he thought it wasn't too late to sell the land at a loss and walk away with whatever was left before things got worse. Walter listened without responding for a long moment, then told Frank he wasn't ready to give up on something he hadn't yet had the chance to fully understand. The lowest point came during the spring of the second year, when a bank representative called Walter directly to inform him that a balloon payment on part of his loan was coming due earlier than he had planned for, a detail buried in the original terms that Walter had either misunderstood or overlooked entirely in his eagerness to close on the property. The amount due was more than he had any way of producing within the given time frame. For the first time since buying the land, Walter seriously considered the possibility that he would lose everything, not gradually, but within a matter of weeks. He drove out to the property alone one evening that spring and sat in the old barn for hours, turning the numbers over in his head without finding any combination that worked in his favor. Diane found him there that night, sitting in the dark long after he was expected home for dinner. She has said since that it was the only time in their marriage she saw him fully consider giving up. He told her plainly that he might have made a mistake, that he might have taken a risk that was going to cost their family more than either of them could afford to lose. Diane didn't offer easy comfort that night. Instead, she asked him a single question, one that would end up mattering more than either of them realized at the time. She asked him what it was, exactly, that had made him stop his truck on that road all those months ago in the first place, before any of this had started. Walter didn't have a clean answer for her that night, but the question stayed with him over the following days. He found himself returning, almost involuntarily, to that slow-moving creek along the eastern edge of the property, the one detail about the land that had never behaved the way everything else on it did. In a desperate attempt to find any possible way to raise enough money to cover the coming payment, Walter contacted a county extension office to ask whether there was any value at all in the property beyond farming it in the traditional sense. It was a conversation born entirely out of financial panic rather than any grand vision, and it would end up leading him toward the one detail about his land that nobody, including Walter himself, had ever taken seriously enough. The agent Walter spoke with at the county extension office suggested, almost as an afterthought, that the unusual consistency of his creek's flow during a period of regional drought might indicate an underground spring feeding the property from below, something worth having tested if he had any interest in it. Walter had little money left to spend on anything that wasn't strictly necessary, but something about Diane's question from weeks earlier had lodged itself in his mind, and he arranged for a water testing service to visit the property, paying for it with money he quietly borrowed from his own brother, a conversation he still describes as one of the more difficult of his life. The results came back several weeks later, and what they showed was not what anyone involved had expected going into it. The water feeding that creek came from a natural aquifer sitting beneath the property, and according to the testing service, it was exceptionally pure, low in the kinds of minerals that typically required expensive filtration, and flowing at a volume that had remained stable even during the driest stretch the region had experienced in over a decade. Walter didn't fully understand the commercial implications of what he was looking at when he first received the report. It was Diane, reading through the documentation late one night at their kitchen table, who first raised the idea directly, asking Walter plainly whether the two of them were sitting on the exact kind of resource that companies paid enormous amounts of money to bottle and sell. The idea felt almost absurd to Walter at first, a fantasy too large to take seriously given how close they currently were to losing everything. But with the balloon payment deadline now only weeks away, and no other realistic options in front of him, Walter reached out to a small regional beverage distributor 2 counties over, a modest operation that supplied bottled water to local grocery stores and restaurants. He brought them a sample from the property along with the test results, expecting little. Within 2 weeks, the distributor called back with a small initial order, nothing large, but enough immediate cash to cover the coming loan payment and keep the bank from taking further action against the land. That first small order did not make Walter wealthy, and it did not silence the doubts that still lingered in his own mind about whether this idea had any real future behind it. But it changed something important. It gave him just enough breathing room to survive the immediate crisis, and it planted a question in his mind that he could no longer ignore, one that echoed the exact question Diane had asked him months earlier in that dark barn. What if the land had never actually failed the 2 families before him? What if they had simply been looking at the wrong thing the entire time, focused on crops the soil was never suited for, while the one resource that could have saved them ran quietly beneath their feet the whole time, unnoticed and untested? Word of the small distribution deal reached the diner on Main Street within days, and for the first time since Walter had bought the land, the tone of the conversation shifted, though not entirely in his favor. Some still dismissed it as a temporary stroke of luck unlikely to amount to much. Frank, hearing the news secondhand once again, called Walter directly this time, cautious but noticeably less dismissive than before, asking pointed questions about the testing results and the terms of the distribution agreement. Walter answered honestly, admitting he still had no long-term plan beyond proving the water could sustain something larger than a single small order. Neither man could have predicted, in that conversation, just how quickly the next several years would unfold. Over the following 18 months, What began as a single small distribution order slowly expanded into something Walter had never fully allowed himself to imagine during the darkest stretch of that second year. Word among regional grocers spread quietly at first, then more quickly, as store buyers began requesting larger orders based on customer demand for a locally sourced product with an increasingly recognizable story attached to it. Walter reinvested nearly every dollar of early profit directly back into the land, drilling a proper well to access the aquifer more efficiently, constructing a modest bottling structure on the property, and hiring his first 2 employees, both of whom had grown up in the same town and had heard the same stories everyone else had about the land being cursed. The growth did not come without new obstacles, ones in many ways more complicated than the financial strain of the earlier years. A larger regional beverage company took notice of Walter's rising local success and approached him directly with an offer to buy the water rights to his property outright, a sum of money that would have instantly made Walter and Diane more financially secure than they had ever imagined being. Walter turned the offer down without much hesitation, a decision that surprised even Diane, who reminded him gently of how recently they had nearly lost everything. Walter told her simply that he hadn't spent 2 difficult years fighting for this land just to hand the one thing that saved it over to someone else. That refusal led to a tense period during which the larger company attempted to challenge Walter's water rights through a series of legal filings, arguing that the aquifer beneath his land extended into a broader regional water source that should not belong exclusively to a single small operation. The dispute stretched on for the better part of a year, requiring Walter to spend money he could barely spare on legal representation, all while continuing to grow his own operation under the weight of ongoing uncertainty. The case was eventually settled in Walter's favor, based largely on the original property deed's clearly defined water rights, a resolution that finally allowed him to expand without the threat of losing everything to a company far larger than his own. With the legal matter behind him, Walter's operation grew at a pace that would have seemed impossible to the version of himself standing in that barn during the second year, uncertain whether he would even keep the land. He expanded distribution beyond grocery stores into restaurants, then into neighboring states, building a small but dedicated staff that grew year over year as demand for the product continued rising. Diane eventually left her nursing position to help manage the growing business directly, a decision she has said felt like the natural continuation of a partnership that had already survived far harder tests than anything the business itself could throw at them. Frank, watching from a distance that had grown noticeably shorter over time, began quietly recommending Walter's product to his own customers. Today, the land that once sat abandoned for years, dismissed by an entire town as cursed and unsellable, supports a full bottling operation employing several dozen people from the surrounding community, supplying stores and restaurants across 3 states. The collapsed fencing and stripped farmhouse that once defined the property have long since been replaced with modern facilities built directly on the same ground where Walter once sat alone in the dark, questioning whether he had made the worst decision of his life. Independent estimates place the value of Walter's business today at approximately $47 million, a figure that would have seemed like fiction to the man who once borrowed money quietly from his own brother just to afford a single water test. The same diner on Main Street where men once joked openly about Walter's failure now regularly serves his product on tap, a detail the owner mentions proudly to out-of-town visitors who ask about it. Several of the men who once dismissed the purchase as the worst mistake they'd ever seen a neighbor make now work directly for Walter's operation, a fact none of them discuss with much embarrassment, since Walter has never once brought up their earlier doubts to shame them for it. Frank, in more recent conversations, has openly admitted that he misjudged his brother-in-law entirely, describing Walter's patience during those difficult early years as something he doubts he could have managed himself under the same pressure. There is one additional detail about the land that Walter did not learn until several years into building the business, one that has stayed with him more than almost anything else about the entire experience. While reviewing old county records related to a separate water rights matter, Walter discovered documentation showing that his own grandfather, a man he barely remembered from early childhood, had once worked briefly as a hired hand on that exact property generations earlier, decades before either of the 2 families who later lost it had ever taken ownership. Walter has said that learning this made the entire experience feel less like an accident and more like something that had been waiting, quietly, for the right person to notice it again. When people ask Walter today what made him certain enough to risk everything his family had saved on a piece of land that had already ruined two other men, he tends to give an answer that surprises most listeners. He tells them he wasn't certain at all. He tells them there were entire years where he seriously doubted the decision, nights in that barn where giving up felt like the only reasonable option left. What he had, he says, wasn't certainty, but a refusal to walk away from something before he had genuinely exhausted every possibility in front of him. The same refusal that once cost him a missed opportunity in his 20s, and the one he promised himself he would never repeat again if given a second chance. Diane, when asked about those difficult years, rarely frames the story as one of pure triumph. She speaks openly about the fear she carried during that first winter, the arguments at the kitchen table, and the night she found her husband sitting alone in the dark, questioning everything he'd built. What she says she remembers most, though, is the moment she asked him a single question about why he had first stopped his truck on that road. A question she asked not because she expected an answer that would change anything, but because she wanted to understand the man she had trusted with everything they owned. She has said since that she never could have predicted where that single question would eventually lead them. So we're left with a story that resists a clean, simple lesson. Was Walter's decision an act of extraordinary vision, or simply an enormous risk that happened to work out in his favor? Would the same instinct that saved him have just as easily destroyed another man in a slightly different set of circumstances? Frank still says, half joking, that he's not sure even Walter fully understood what he was betting on that first morning at the bank. Walter himself has never fully disagreed with that assessment. What he does say, when pressed, is that the land never owed him anything, and that whatever it eventually gave back, it gave back on its own terms, at its own pace, and only after he refused to leave. Would you have signed those papers, knowing what Walter knew at the time, or would you have listened to everyone telling you to walk away? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in his position, and if you've ever made a decision in your own life that everyone around you doubted, we'd love to hear that story too. If you enjoyed following Walter's journey from that cold morning in the mud to where he stands today, subscribe so you don't miss the next story we bring you, because the next one might be even harder to believe than this one.